you were a general secretary of the JNU Student Union back in the days in 1973, 1974, and like the third student union of the university at the time where Prakash Karat was president of the union. So the really formative days of the union that was started from scratch. We wanted to know from you how you came to student activism and how that commitment reflected on your intellectual interest at the time and how they manifest concretely in the social space of the campus.
Okay, I joined JNU in 1973 to do my MA in history, but I had been active for about a year or so already in Delhi University in student politics. I was a member of All India Student Federation, AISF, and that had basically started because in my undergraduate years, I'd been reading Marx. On my own. It wasn't part of the curriculum, but I remember in my second year of BA, I had read 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and Class Struggles in France and Peasant War in Germany by Marx, and that basically got me thinking into left politics. And so when I came to JNU. AISF was a very, very small organization. The dominant organization was SFI. And when I joined, there was a great deal of resentment among students against the SFI. They found it domineering, dictatorial, and a group called Freethinkers had formed to oppose the SFI. So AISF and SFI went into an alliance against the freethinkers, and I remember even before the elections happened, there was a pamphlet war where we published various critiques of the freethinkers, and freethinkers responded. Unfortunately, I can't get hold of those pamphlets, but that was the kind of lead up to the elections. And there was another small group called the Marxist Forum, which was formed by Jairus Banerjee and some other students, which was in a kind of alliance with the freethinkers because they were also opposed to the SFI, but I don't think they had put up any candidates. But what the Marxist Forum did was to inject, kind of serious discussion on history of communism, of Marxism, and so on in student politics. Jairus Banerjee in particular, he was very erudite, very impressive, a good speaker. And I remember he used to come to some of the classes and, give a lecture on Levi Strauss or someone like that, and how those issues were, connected to contemporary politics. So those were the kind of discussions. I mean, the student debates that were held, each one of us who was a candidate had to engage in these debates. And, I'd never engaged in this kind of a public debate. So it was harrowing at first, but, once you got into it, the moment kind of took over, and you were able to at least not make a fool of yourself, and engage with your opponent. So it was a very kind of I would say, energetic election, largely carried out in terms of discussions on ideas about national and international politics, and we won. So, uh, you know, that was a good feeling.
That was a generation of course of individuals who then moved on to some to political careers, some to academic careers for the most part. Um, the the free thinker slogan was let's do politics from below. We saw with Avarna Anand Kumari recently, and we were struck in retrospect to see how much Marxist student politics in JNU has been in various shades, not only SFI but later on AISA and other student groups coming from different Marxist traditions, but how little post-structuralism um, and the the kind of intellectual movement who emerges as a critique of Marxist South for the study of South Asian historiography. We were wondering, since you have such expertise on the field, whether at the time, whether from Jairus Banerjee or others, there such critique had emerged, and whether it infused the kind of fierce debate that were happening at the time.
Um, Most of the debates really centered around the history of Marxism.
Mm.
One of the interesting things about JNU socially was that for many people who were coming from different parts of India, it was really the first time that people from the south, from the north, from the west, they were all in one single space of India. And JNU's slogan was national integration, but really that was really the first time that in my own personal experience I had encountered people from different parts of India who brought very, very different experiences. Um, and so, to begin with, for example, there were no discussions, for example, on the Hindu-Muslim issue. Uh,
Mm.
I don't think ABVP was even present on campus, and if there were any ABVP supporters, certainly they
They were high.
exercised no influence at all. They were invisible. Even the Congress was invisible. So, uh, so I think the JNU experiment created a social atmosphere where people from different backgrounds who came together were almost sort of bound by some invisible thread of ideas, and not by caste or religion or any of those things. All those things were obviously present, and were under the surface, but the trend of kind of student politics was to take everyone towards certain kind of common issues that we thought faced India and the world. So, and it was also the time of the early 1970s where certain notions of the third world were very much in the air. So we were thinking not only nationally, but also internationally. Um, so the questions that really exercised us, aside from the history of Marxism, were issues that were occurring internationally. So, for example, when the military coup happened in Chile in 1973, um, I remember we had a very well attended, packed meeting addressed by Tariq Ali on Chile. Then uh, Allende's daughter and his wife, they came to JNU and addressed meetings. We held actions on things that were going on in Spain against Franco's dictatorship. Uh, so, our kind of eyes were turned not towards some of the other issues that occupied, Indian politics at that time, Congress and Jansang and, and those kinds of political fights, but really political fights that had, firstly, ideological implications for India, but internationally, they were connected to things that were happening and that were important for, third world politics.
Mhm. That's really what you're saying is extremely fascinating. It really triggers, I think, an important question in my mind just at the moment. As you are mentioning those invisible threads, would you say that they were the product of the international background of that generation? Um, the I think Batavial has called that the red brick generation. So the were those concerns crafted by a certain Marxist uh, interest, but also a certain international exposure that kind of enabled that generation to link the local and national issue with broader factual and theoretical debates, global in nature, or were those invisible threads formalized and forged by the mundane everyday life of the campus, where they are in fact solidifying in the social context of the campus, with its friendship, with professional mentorship. Um, what was what was the determining factor in solidifying those invisible threads?
Well, let me take the international issue first. Um, I mean, it was a time before, let's say, current globalization. And, uh, at the moment, or at least since the 90s, at least, market drives global linkages. I think that was a time before the market driven global relations where you thought of globality in terms of politics, in terms of ideas, in terms of geopolitics. So it was not market driven. And so many of our, understanding of the international drove from, I suppose, when I think back, these were driven from, existing political and geopolitical movements, such as, that things that emerged out of Bandung or, Third World and so on. I mean, I remember even when I was a student in BA in Delhi University, we staged a play on Che, which was written by an Italian playwright, Mario Fratti, I remember. And it was a play that was, it had kind of Maoist leanings. So it was leftist, but it was anti-communist. And it had a vision of international solidarity through the figure of Che. And so, if you think of figures like Che and later on Angela Davis, how they became these kind of global icons. And they became global icons through the circulation of ideas of international solidarity around leftist ideas. So the international, issues that energized student politics at that time and that bound us together. I guess they had their origins in politics and ideology on the kind of a global scale before the market. So that was one aspect of the international. The second was, of course, the class composition of JNU students. Although students, progressively came from broader social backgrounds, but initially, in 1973, 74, 75, I remember, a large part of the student body was, drawn from relatively well-off classes and classes who were conversant in English. And so student politics, for example, was conducted almost entirely in English. And in that sense, Anand Kumar was different. Anand Kumar came from UP. He came from a socialist Hindi background. He gave many of his speeches in Hindi. He was a great orator, and he could really play with the language. So people who were conversant in English and who came from this sort of well-off background, they were able to speak to international issues because also of their class and because of English. And that is why, I think some of the issues of caste and religion were sort of under the surface. They were never front and center in the 70s.
Just as a follow-up, as a ironic kind of question, do you think that Anand Kumar, in fact, was a precursor as he vernacularized student politics before the actual vernacularization of the massive vernacularization of Indian politics in the 80s and 90s?
Certainly, and part of the attraction of Anand Kumar among students was that he represented the underrepresented in JNU, people who were not fluent in English, people who came from non-elite backgrounds, and it was again, that issue wasn't front and center, but that undercurrent was very much there.
That the one of those things that comes really often in the the philosophy of the left among various Marxist group is the notion of declassing. Um, and even nowadays, among groups that are issues that have linked with the with CPIML and other formerly Naxalite groups, this idea of declassing is extremely important to become kind of representative of the uncounted masses, quote unquote. Would you say that it were genuine attempts at the time from sections of the students with a Marxist background, but with a rather elite upbringings and a rather international exposure, to go through that declassing process in order to appear more legitimate for oneself, also for the body of the students while conducting their politics.
I don't think that, declassing was a prominent phenomenon. And if it was, it appeared in the form of a certain kind of bohemian lifestyle.
Mm.
So people who were of the kind of left orientation, uh, led a life that, didn't care for, some of the kind of trappings of middle class respectability. It was, for example, represented in the kind of gender relations that existed in JNU, which was, radically different even from a place like Delhi University. The relationship between men and women was very free and open. That male and female students could become friendly and hang out together, spend time together, go for tea and go for films and so on, which didn't necessarily involve any kind of romantic relation necessarily, where you could be friends. Now, this was an aspect of bohemian life that you could say, was, though not consciously driven by any desire to declass, but at least it was an attempt to lead a different kind of life than the one prescribed by the middle classes. It wasn't driven by kind of professionalization, as if you were there in the university in order to prepare for a job and lead a middle class life. You were leading a life of ideas, of politics, and that involved a certain kind of freedom and freedom from accepted social mores.
Was there a certain reluctance to prepare for civil service examinations or other kind of jobs that were associated both with middle class aspirations and with the state?
Uh, People who prepared for the IAS examination, for example, they did so secretly. Nobody wanted to, openly confess that they wanted to become part of the ruling class. So, uh, as it turned out, that later on, a lot of JNU people joined the civil services. But during my time, there weren't that many people who would openly confess to be preparing for the civil service examinations. And many of them who did, though not exclusively, uh, generally tended to be from the freethinkers,
I see.
which was another knock against them.
That they were not denying the aspiration of people they aspire to represent.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if the radical politics was based on, opposition to the regime, then the idea that you would aspire to become a member of the ruling bureaucracy was strictly a kind of a no-no, and that's why, you know, people who did so without openly flaunting that they were taking the IAS examination.
I see. I see. I'm happy to tell you that even nowadays it is still the case.
I see.
That a lot of student activists uh, not secretly aspire, but are not reluctant to it. But it's still a very stigmatized um, life decision to kind of prepare for those examinations. If I may, let me just pause the recording because I'm always afraid that those things stop working. So stop.
Okay.
Definitely. Let me ask him. Let me ask him. That would be a great idea. Um, we met. I met Sunit Chopra also some time ago.
Okay.
He was really also found. He was also really happy to share some of his material and to discuss about those days. Um, who else did we meet? Not Albina. What was her name? Indrani. We met Indrani also.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So we are, and of course we met Prakash Karat last week, and we are meeting again this month or next month. Same for Sitaram Yechuri. So from those days, we were kind of piling up things. I had a question. I had a question for you, as you know, you such tremendous insight on the sociology of the city, or the anthropology of the city, or the theory of the city. I was wondering to which extent you thought it would be appropriate to think of uh, the university as a space conducive for self-change, self-transformation, political exploration, um, as a kind of public sphere in a otherwise region that lacks such spaces, and in which extent those public spheres, or whatever we want to call it, nurture and creates, if not a new political class, but at least active citizens who are part of the thin crust of those who dissent and participate to political activities are generally going against the current regime.
Well, we were, of course, not completely conscious of this at that time. But, one thing that was striking in moving from Delhi University to JNU was that whereas in Delhi University, student politics was driven by party politics, where student union elections were often based on muscle politics and just gathering your votes and so on. Uh, JNU provided a stage where what was in command were ideas about sort of public benefit, where one could pursue politics in terms of certain principles and ideas rather than establishing a kind of a party hegemony. Um, so in that sense, JNU was such a breath of fresh air after Delhi University, where you really felt that you could truly explore things both socially and politically. I mean, just in terms of the friendships you formed, the daily life on campus, uh, the relationship between politics and your student life uh, were, so different from anything that I had experienced and many other people had experienced. That you felt that, it was a space where you could really come onto your own. It was. I mean, I think, looking back, it was a period where I think, a lot of kind of self growth happened, um, because you were not bound by um things that, for example, were so prominent in places like, Delhi University, where, politics was a completely different realm. Here, politics seemed, part of your daily life. So what you were studying in class didn't seem disconnected with what you pursued in your political life.
Hmm. I think you pointed out this idea of self-growth. I think it's extremely relevant for qualifying and understanding the political processes at work. Would you say that a few thin crust of universities around the country, public universities, had a predominant influence in shaping the political and ideological understanding of political movements, Aligarh, the post-Nehruvian Muslim identity, JNU, the various layers of Marxist and socialist thought, HCU and Osmania, the various layers of Dalit politics. How would you understand the space of campus in informing dissonance or new ideas in the political debate?
Well, I think what makes JNU different is that although you had, student politics in all these different campuses that you mentioned, BHU, Aligarh, Allahabad, Patna, uh, Calcutta, and so on, people who came out of those other campuses. So if you think of someone like, Arun Jaitley, who was, president of Delhi University Students Union, you can, if you track their career, you say, okay, so and so like Jaitley cut his teeth in student politics in Delhi University, and that gave him a platform later on for national politics. Then you see it in terms of a kind of a career graph. Whereas in JNU, the idea wasn't that, I mean, none of us thought that we were preparing ourselves for, a later career in national politics. We didn't see it in terms of career graph. And that's why, today when, some of the people who went to JNU and you find them in the current BJP government, people from my time are appalled because they think that JNU gave you a certain kind of understanding of politics, of life, and that politics was based on ideas. So then see some of the like the Jaishankar, who's now the foreign minister, to think that these people, went to JNU and now are pursuing politics as if, politics is a matter of, getting opportunity and power, etc. It stands so contrary to what JNU stood for. Uh, that is why I think, JNU was a different kind of a campus than, let's say, Aligarh or these other places where, student politics kind of prepared you for, uh, later uh, career in politics. So, I mean, in JNU, politics wasn't seen as a career. It wasn't seen as, a training ground, a nursery for, national politics.
Would you say that figures that now attempt to emerge in the national scenario coming from JNU, Sheila Rashid, Kanaya Kumar, and the 2016 generation, do you think that they they have to unlearn, or what what is at stake is to undo some of the GNU training in order to be fit to the ideological or the pragmatic or the empirical realities of national politics?
Well, I think one thing that has happened is that, JNU has been nationalized, by which I mean that, during our time, although JNU student politics often engaged with national and international politics, it was a bit of an island, given, the landscape of student politics in India. It stood apart. But by, I think, the late 80s and 90s, also as kind of student body of JNU changed quite substantially. JNU itself was nationalized, and that is why you find by the 90s, groups like NSUI and ABVP also emerging as, forces on campus. And so by the time you get to Kanhaiya Kumar and Sheila Rashid and so on, now suddenly, issues that happen on JNU become the fodder for national politics. I mean, I remember, in the 70s, newspaper reports on JNU, when they appeared, they often took JNU as a kind of a curiosity. What is this place? Student politics is so strange over here. When I was doing my research for this book on the emergency, I was going back and looking at some of the newspaper cuttings from the 70s. And, there was a sense of amused surprise in the newspapers about JNU. It was seen as like something odd and very strange, and not quite of part of the university landscape. But by the late 90s and early 2000 and so on, JNU became completely nationalized, and that is why you find figures who people like Kanhaiya and Sheila Rashid, who were prominent in JNU politics, also become prominent in national discussion. That never happened in the 70s.
That never happened, also because maybe the university was not the target of a certain discourse to crystallize the enemy or the opponent in spaces like GNU.
Yeah, certainly, but I think that is part of the nationalization. That when JNU becomes fully kind of a nationalized and part of the kind of a national scape, then the idea of us versus them, national versus anti-national, which is part of the national discourse, also enters, JNU.
Definitely. If we go back quickly to your student days in GNU, where in in historical studies, or in the circle you were gravitating, was that space, politically speaking, really enabling, preparing the ground for you to kind of revisit both Marxism and then subaltern studies in your later career? Or could at least a certain sense of interest, could you locate it? Can you locate it in those days, or did that happen before, or did that happen after? How instrumental that political / intellectual space was for you in your later development, intellectual development?
As I said before, one of the things about characteristic about JNU was that what you studied in the classroom wasn't separated from what you pursued in politics. So what you were reading in, at least in my history center, the books and articles and things we were discussing were connected to what one was pursuing in politics, and that meant that you were constantly sort of examining your political life as well in light of what you were reading in your history classes. And so that's why by the time I was doing my MPhil in JNU, I found that I had reached a certain kind of a plateau in terms of thinking about Marxism and history both. That JNU had given us a lot, but I felt I was not learning anything more. That we were just kind of spinning wheels. I had learned a certain amount of things, but I wasn't sort of going anywhere. And that's the time I began to think about, going abroad for PhD. So for one thing, I found that, for example, in history, although the history faculty was very open and we read a number of different things, but it was still very much confined within the discipline of history. And I thought that, I had things to learn from other disciplines, in particular anthropology. And it just felt that, JNU didn't provide that kind of interdisciplinary space in order to explore both history as a discipline, but also more broadly what that interdisciplinary training could provide me in thinking about politics in general. And so that's when I began to think about, applying for PhD abroad, and then I came to the US, and then when I started my PhD work, and particularly when I was doing field work on bonded labor in Bihar, many of these kind of ideas, came together. And it's perhaps it's not coincidental that, when I did my field work and finished my PhD in 1984, that was just around the time where subaltern studies was also on its own, moving towards ideas that I was moving towards. So I could say that, JNU provided me with a certain platform, and that platform, after a while, seemed limited. And then, but it was a platform that was needed for me to then, go forward.
Of course, yes. Limiting at the same time enabling. I really like your comment. I have just a last question on for myself. Maybe Avarna has one also. Um, Regarding the strategies the strategies of contentions or the repertoire of contentions. As you said, GNU was a space of experimentation in which politics knowledge in class and politics outside of it was very much connected and was very much related uh, to what you said as self-growth. Was it also a certain form of trial and error in terms of political mobilization and political strategies that were implemented on campus? I was told an anecdote recently about Sitaram Yechuri stealing milk from the warden in order to complain about the bad quality of the milk in hostel messes. So I was wondering whether there were also experimentation in terms of how mass mobilization, even though it was never mass mobilization, imagination of mass mobilization enable new political experiment in terms of group management, kind of.
Well, there was, of course, experimentation, and we, often took actions like, for example, I was a student in the History Center, but we actually, in the union, we led actions against the History Center, which didn't make me very popular with my professors, and I paid for it in the long run. But we led an action against the History Center because we thought that the History Center admissions policies were such that they admitted a large number of relatively privileged students from Delhi University. And
there was a limit. There was a quota for Delhi residents, right, or something of the.
So much a quota. It sort of worked with the idea that a certain percentage was given to oral interviews as opposed to academic record. This is before the kind of entrance examination system was introduced, which meant that at least we felt that the history faculty then admitted relatively privileged English-speaking students from Delhi University disproportionately by giving them very high marks in oral interviews. And so we led a strike against the History Center. Now, if you think about, why we took such an action, I think this was partly, of course, driven by ideology, but it was also driven by the fact that, and as I said, JNU was also a kind of a social experiment where you were meeting students from, a variety of different backgrounds from different parts of India, and that experience also told us that there are many things that a student brings to the university, and a kind of formal competence in certain area or certain privileged background should be the determining factor. So, in that sense, the action against the History Center was driven by our experience with students in JNU as a kind of a social body. And it actually mattered that, JNU was, very small. I mean, I think at that time, maybe the student body was no more than 800 or 900, which meant that, you knew a lot of the students, personally. Um, you may not have been friends with everyone, but you sort of knew everyone. Um, and that kind of daily, kind of a personal face-to-face exchange meant that you were also then open to, different ideas. It that ideology didn't always kind of shut doors. Um, if someone you knew personally and you kind of respected that person personally, then it was more likely that you would hear that person out, even if that person held different views from yours. So I think that kind of personalized face-to-face exchange kind of atmosphere uh, encouraged you to think of different ideas and entertain different ideas, even if they were very different from yours.
Also, in terms of political mobilization, or not necessarily, or where the way of mobilizing orthodox and in line with what was happening outside of JNU.
Yeah, for example, the use of art. Um, the use of art in political propaganda. Obviously, it has a long history, but certainly it was very different from what I knew in Delhi University, where art was never part of your kind of organizing. Whereas here, we sought out people who could draw well, who could make sort of attractive posters. So, I mean, form as part of the kind of content of politics and the content of political organizing became important, even though we were not sort of consciously thinking of that in these kind of conceptual terms. But in practice, that is what we were doing. We were exploring a whole range of things as part of political organizing, where art, cinema, these were not considered things that are outside the realm of politics.
Do you consider the pamphlets as part of it? Do you consider the pamphlet as a tool of socialization, also a certain grammar of politics in the way it is indicative in
Very much,
grasping? Mhm.
very much so. I mean, I think pamphleteering. So to begin with, pamphleteering involved a certain amount of collaboration. Somebody would write it, then you would gather it together. Then you would edit it together. Um, you would add art to it, uh, and then you would take that text to. I remember there was a cyclostyling place in Munirka. You would get it cyclostyled over there, bring it, distribute it. So it was a kind of a collective enterprise where the pamphlets were not just seen as things that establish your presence, but really a means of kind of persuading people. It was, the pamphlet war was, how shall I put it? I mean, it was another way to engage in kind of a battle of ideas.
Was it a tool also to access the students, to have a chance to interact with them?
Yes, I mean, the pamphlets would then, immediately uh, lead to, discussions. So, and which is what, we wanted. You distribute a pamphlet and you expected that, there would be a kind of reaction, either favorable or, unfavorable. But it would at least provoke a discussion and a discussion of ideas that we wanted, or whatever be the issue.
Would you say that, in a sense, the pamphlet as a metonymia could serve as a broader image of a certain styling of politics in which you are vituperative, in which you try to grasp the attention of people, in which you always build on a certain aspiration of youth, a certain constant discontent, um, dramatize reality of the country and of the international stage in order to bring emotions up, but at the same time link it to a really identifiable theoretical framework. Would you agree to if you read something like this on the kind of allegorical function of the pamphlet as a socializing tool, but also as a certain style of doing politics?
Yeah, I mean, there was an art to writing pamphlets. I mean, not everyone could write these pamphlets. So in AISF, we had a student, Anand Sahai, who is a journalist, very senior journalist now. And he was great at writing pamphlets because he could be sharp, he could be punchy, could be funny. You could make fun of your opponents and drive home the point. So in a way, you understood that pamphlet was a very specific kind of thing. It was not like a manifesto. It wasn't a poster. It was a different thing. It was its own animal, and you needed someone who was really good at language, who was good at striking at the kind of heart of the matter, and present it in this kind of really punchy fashion. And I had to perform all of these kind of different functions, make fun of your opponent, undermine their arguments, and present your ideas in this really catchy way, so that if there were certain terms that you use became the kind of a currency of student discussion.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that with the advent of online politics, the pamphlets as a social as a online in its online form retain its pamphleteer components, but lost the social connect, lost the ability to maybe reach at a more intimate level to people and socialize them together?
I mean, there was something about the physicality of the pamphlet, which the online discussion doesn't have. The the texture of the pamphlet, the feel of the paper, the way it was printed, the way it appeared, and so that kind of a tactile quality of pamphlet exchange was something that the online battle doesn't really have, and it produced face-to-face kind of exchange, even if the pamphlet was, let's say, distributed overnight, under the student dorm doors. But but the next day, people had those pamphlets, and and often you would engage in discussion with the pamphlet in students' hand. So the physicality of it, had a certain quality that online discussion doesn't have.
Doesn't have, of course. That maybe it makes it more acrimonious and conflictual to release pamphleteer material online, and maybe there is less discussion and there's less debate regarding, on those objects if they are posted online. That your is a great insight. Would you say that this pamphleteer culture has been instrumental in in creating a dissentive generation or Azadi generation that we see nowadays? Is
I think what the pamphlet tradition did was to, um, create physical exchanges of ideas. And when you engage with another person in person, um, it has a different quality than the kind of online war. So, you cannot ignore the humanity of the other person when you are exchanging pamphlets. So, which meant that even when uh, pamphlets were acrimonious, uh, it didn't lead to the idea that you were my enemy. So you could have dissenting views, you could have opposing views without thinking that the political battle was a life and death battle between you and your enemy. You know, it was a kind of different culture. I don't know what the culture in JNU now is in terms of pamphlets. But many things have changed. The student population has increased, and so I don't know how pamphlets function now.
they are not disappeared, but they are slowly taking a more online kind of form. The pamphlet culture, when I did my fieldwork 2014-15, was still very much there, because the WhatsApp phenomena had still not reached the scale it has now. Um, but today it has definitely become the main kind of tool for campaigning, along with physical presence, and the pamphlet is still there to give an excuse to access the student community, but definitely has been replaced in terms of circulation of motto ideas, slogans, and partisan positioning by this online activism on the various platforms. So I guess there is a precarious ecosystem in which the physical object is still there, but it becomes less and less relevant and becomes more and more nakedly obvious that it's an object for social interaction rather than for idea circulation.
Okay.
That's my sense of it, but things are changing so fast these days, and the post 2016 environment with more and more obstacles to physical political participation
Yeah.
has
So
also.
even the posters on the wall, the poster art, the wall art has now, I think JNU has declared it illegal or something. 3 years ago I went and took lots of pictures because one of the things that changed a lot for the better, particularly with ISA. I think ISA seemed to have had lots of artists. Um, they did really dramatic sort of wall art. And I took pictures about 3 or 4 years ago. But this time when I went this summer, a lot of it had disappeared.
They have removed them. They really chasing them, but we are recreating on the ground of the exhibition. We have Anupam Roy, who was an ISA artist.
Mm.
Ashok Bhumik will also contribute.
Mm.
So we're trying to relocate that
Yeah.
dying art in the space of the exhibition. I am wondering how the gallery will react, but we'll see.
I mean, during that time, there was an artist, Sampad Mahapatra, who was very good at, creating these very artistic posters and so on. He lives in Orissa now. If you can get hold of him, he might have something from that time.
Of course. He was from.
He may have been in Free Thinkers, Sampad Mahapatra.
It's wonderful. Let me see if we can get a hold on.
On Facebook, you can maybe send him a Facebook message.
Is he friend with yours or by any chance?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll look for this. I just because Avarna has been here online with us for so long. Avarna,
I have questions.
if Gyan, if I may, allows, do you any insight or any feeling you have, or any question you have regarding this?
You asking me?
Yes.
I'm asking Avarna if she has a question
I
for
do.
you.
I do. Sorry, I think we both got confused. I do have a few questions, which I'm thinking how to articulate. So you mentioned that in the campus there was a lot of concern for.
Not really. I mean, I think the world has changed so much that you don't find a similar kind of a discussion. And as I was saying earlier, the global linkages today are so much determined by the market that the kind of international discussions of solidarity and so on that were expressed in the 70s prior to the dominance of the market, that they had a very different kind of a tenor than, whatever international exchange that takes place. I mean, you could say that in one sense, the world is more connected today than it was then. Today, there's almost kind of instantaneous discussion of, ideas in circulation, books that people are reading, So things that I'm reading, let's say in the US, are also being read in India almost at the same time. So things are much more simultaneous. But they're driven by other things. They're driven by Facebook. They're driven by social media. They're driven by, journals which are available online and so on. I think that kind of simultaneity didn't exist at that time, and yet some of these international things, like for example, if you think about Gramsci in the 70s. Now, we knew Gramsci because Shridhar Kaviraj was also teaching Gramsci in his class on socialist theory. And we were also encountering Gramscian ideas in student politics, Now, that kind of international linkage was not driven by the market. It wasn't driven by social media. It wasn't driven by the kind of electronic communication that exists today. So which meant that the approach towards the international had a very different texture at that time. Is that what you were asking me?
I mean, sorry, I was thinking aloud as well. But different texture, what do you mean by that?
I mean that, it was so, for example, I remember reading Karl Kautsky's writing on the agrarian question, which was written in German, but, Jairus Banerjee had translated that into English and cyclostyled it, and it was kind of physically distributed. Okay, so now you think of Karl Kautsky writing in the early 20th century. We're reading it in the 1970s. It doesn't have any kind of immediate political implication, and yet you are reading it in order to think of ideas about the agrarian revolution in India in the 1970s. Okay, and you're reading it through this kind of a cyclostyled exchange which had passed through various hands. So this is what I mean. There's a kind of physicality to this kind of exchange with international ideas that reading Jacobin online today doesn't have the same kind of impact.
I think that's kind of leaning towards the other curiosity I had. I read in your book the acknowledgement where you mentioned that you had met your wife during the same time, and you mentioned as well in our conversation that around that time the politics and personal wasn't so distinct. It was very interlinked, very shaping each other. I was wondering how post the 75 year, in what way did that particular year shape your future, not just in terms of academia, but in other realms of life? That's a rather broad question to ask, but was it like a was it like a deliberation?
The personal and political, yes. You were engaged in something that really mattered. The political ideas that they seemed the most important thing in life at that moment. And given the atmosphere of JNU, where you were also engaging, with women who were similarly inspired and interested in those ideas. It so happened that my wife Aruna, she was a student in German and then later in linguistics. So sort of personal and political just kind of came together, and we were in politics together, and then we got involved, and that happened with many people as well. I remember I've been trying to actually locate this article. There was a sociologist called, I think, Bhavani Sengupta. He wrote an article in India Today somewhere in the 70s. It was a kind of an article which I, deeply disliked at that time when I read it. Maybe in the early 80s. It was an article on JNU and how JNU politics was really about, finding marriage partners. I found that deeply offensive, but if you think about it, yes, lots of partnerships were formed that way. I mean, the person I speak about, Prabir Purukayasa, for example, he and Ashok Lata Jain, they came together that way. Politics led to friendship, friendship led to romantic relationship, and so on. So that's why when I was writing Emergency Chronicles, Aruna and I, we would often I would write a sentence, and and then we would talk about that time together, because you could draw on those memories. And although the memories didn't always enter the book itself, but something of that kind of experience drove my writing.
Were those chronicles inspired by? Did you move abroad before the emergency, or were you there during emergency?
I was here there. I was in India during the emergency. I moved in 1979. So much after the emergency was lifted, and Indira Gandhi was about to come back to power.
Were you still a student at the time? Were you
Yeah,
uh,
student. I was doing MPhil in JNU in the History Center, and I also had a temporary job at Jamia Millia, and so I taught at Jamia Millia for I think 2 years after I finished my MA, while I was doing my MPhil.
were you in touch with the resistance? Were you by in any way or
No, not at all. Because I mean, one of the things was I was in the AISF, and AISF had officially supported the emergency, and but I had deep reservations about it, and so I kind of silently broke away from it without issuing public statements or anything. But that's when I left the AISF.
you became passive and disconnected from the active?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it was, it was confusing for me at that time. I'd been in the ISF for 2, 3 years, and then this happened, and I didn't quite buy the line. On the other hand, I wasn't supportive of the JP movement because I saw many problems with it. So, um, but once the emergency was declared and imposed, and I saw what it did to students in JNU, I became disenchanted with the AISF.
Mm. Was it the same? Did you have the same kind of political trajectory then Kamal Mitra Chenoy, who first supported the emergency and then uh, turned against it in the face of the kind of attitudes and the behavior of the police against students and
So, Kamal also, turned against the emergency, but I mean, I think his open opposition came after the emergency was lifted.
Mm.
And then, of course, he became active in teacher politics, Januta later on, and so on. So I don't exactly know when he expressed his public opposition, but for me, the I don't know. The important thing wasn't really the public opposition. It was just the kind of the world I had made up had fallen, and it and that was one of the reasons why I also began to think about uh, going abroad or thinking all these things afresh and understand what had gone wrong. So for me, the journey was not so much, uh, in the uh, political public realm, but more in terms of rethinking, politics and history and so on.
A personal journey of making sense of what had happened and whether your political commitment at the time made made sense in retrospect with what happened during the emergency. Yeah, I think a lot of the interviews we conducted, in fact, a lot of people who were active once in student politics recount those moments of demobilization, disenchantment, and dissatisfaction with the kind of politics and the repetitiveness of of certain kind of politics, and its betrayal, quote unquote, in ideological terms.
Yeah, for me, it wasn't disenchantment with politics as such. It was just disenchantment with the certain kind of politics that I had pursued and what the AISF had done, and so so I still remain deeply interested in politics and follow it and so on. So, and I still think it's a very important arena. So for me, it wasn't, a kind of withdrawal or becoming a recluse or anything like that. It was just that, it was time to rethink politics itself. And I thought that, I couldn't stay in politics and do it at the same time, and that I needed to kind of step back from active politics and do kind of serious academic work and rethink many of these issues, and that would give political clarity. So yeah, so I'm still very political, but except that I'm not in active politics.